Hello, everyone. My name is Alaa, and I am an Erasmus student from Germany. And as part of the book club in the course Introduction to Sociology, I will be holding this presentation for you today about a special person and one of her works. This course is being lectured by our professor María José del Pino Espejo at the Universidad Pablo de Olavide in Sevilla. So the person I'm gonna be talking about today is Miss Laura James Adam, also known as just Jane Addams. And during her time, Jane Addams was a very famous, influential, and very known feminist and sociologist. And she always wanted to create a settlement house after she once visited one in England, which inspired her. And so she got to found the so-called Hull House in Chicago with one of her colleagues. And she's had a great impact on sociology and also inspired many people, as I've said before, because she always opened up new perspectives and views on different matters and participated and engaged in important things. And she also engaged especially a lot in the peace movement, which is also why she got awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just for her commitment. And so I chose to present the work 20 Years at Hull House, written by Jane Addams herself, because I thought it's gonna be interesting since it's an autobiography written by her herself, and I especially chose to read out chapter 5, which deals with the first days at her founded settlement house, or just the development in general, which I thought would be interesting, to see how Adams views the progress from her own point of view and how she feels and where she puts what she finds important and stuff. And that's why I thought, of course, like the other chapters, the book consists of 18 chapters, and so I thought out of all of these, maybe for an introduction, chapter 5 would be nice to get an overview of the Hull House itself, and maybe also get an idea of the way of thinking of her and where she has her priorities. And hope you enjoy. So, chapter 5, First Days at Hull House. The next January found Miss Starr and myself in Chicago, searching for a neighborhood in which we might put our plans into execution. In our eagerness to find friends for the new undertaking, we utilized every opportunity to set forth the meaning of the settlement as it had been embodied at Tony B. Hall, although in those days we made no appeal for money, meaning to start with our own slender resources. From the very first, the plan received courteous attention, and the discussion, while often skeptical, was always friendly. Professor Swing wrote a commendatory column in the Evening Journal, and our early speeches were reported quite out of proportion to their worth. I recall a spirited evening at the home of Miss Woolmarth, which was attended by the renowned scholar Thomas Davidson, and by a young Englishman who was a member of the then new Fabian Society, and to whom a peculiar glamour was attached because he had scored knives all summer in a camp of high-minded philosophers in the Adirondacks. Our new little plan met with criticism, not to say disapproval, from Mr. Davidson, who, as nearly as I can remember, called it one of those unnatural attempts to understand life through cooperative living. It was in vain. We asserted that the collective living was not an essential part of the plan, that we would always scrupulously pay our own expenses, and that at any moment we might decide to scatter through the neighborhood and to live in separate tenements. He still contended that the fascination for most of those volunteering residents would lie in the collective living aspect of the settlement. His contention was, of course, essentially sound. There is a constant tendency for the residents to lose themselves in the cave of their own companionship, as the Tony B. Hall phrase goes. But, on the other hand, it is doubtless true that the very companionship, the give and take of colleagues, is what tends to keep the settlement normal and in touch with the world of things as they are. I am happy to say that we never resented this, nor any difference of opinion, and that 15 years later, Professor Davidson handsomely acknowledged that the advantages of a group far outweighed the weaknesses he had early pointed out. He was at that moment sharing with a group of young men on the east side of New York his ripest conclusions in philosophy, and was much touched by their intelligent interest and absorbed devotion. I think that time has also justified our early contention that the mere foothold in a house, easily accessible, ample in space, hospitable and tolerant in spirit, situated in the midst of the large foreign colonies which so easily isolate themselves in American cities, would be in itself a serviceable thing for Chicago. I am not so sure that we succeeded in our endeavors to make social intercourse express the growing sense of the economic unity of society and to add the social function to democracy. But Hull House was soberly opened on the theory that the dependence of classes on each other is reciprocal, and that as the social relation is essentially a reciprocal relation, it gives a form of expression that has peculiar value. In our search for a vicinity in which to settle, we went about with the officers at the compulsory education department, with city missionaries, and with the newspaper reporters, whom I recall as a much older set of men than one ordinarily associates with that profession. Or perhaps I was only sent out with the older ones on what they must all have considered a quixotic mission. One Sunday afternoon in the late winter, a reporter took me to visit a so-called anarchist Sunday school, several of which were to be found on the northwest side of the city. The young man in charge was of the German student type, and his face flushed with enthusiasm as he led the children singing one of Körner's poems. The newspaperman, who didn't understand German, asked me what abominable stuff they were singing, but he seemed dissatisfied with my translation of the simple words, and darkly intimated that they were deep ones and probably fooled me. When I replied that Körner was an ardent German poet whose songs inspired his countrymen to resist the aggressions of Napoleon, and that his bound poems were found in the most respectable libraries, he looked at me rather askance, and I then and there had my first intimation that to treat a Chicago man who is called an anarchist as you would treat any other citizen is to lay yourself open to deep suspicion. Another Sunday afternoon in the early spring, on the way to a Bohemian mission in the carriage of one of its founders, we passed a fine old house standing well back from the street, surrounded on three sides by a broad piazza, which was supported by wooden pillars of exceptionally pure Corinthian design and proportion. I was so attracted by the house that I set forth to visit it the very next day, but though I searched for it then and for several days after, I couldn't find it, and at length I most reluctantly gave up the search. 3 weeks later, with the advice of several of the oldest residents of Chicago, including the ex-mayor of the city, Colonel Mason, who had from the first been a warm friend to our plans, we decided upon a location somewhere near the junction of Blue Island Avenue, Halsted Street, and Harrison Street. I was surprised and overjoyed on the very first day of our search for quarters to come upon the hospitable old house, the quest for which I had so recently abandoned. The house was of course rented, the lower part of it used for offices and storerooms in connection with the factories that stood back of it. However, after some difficulties were overcome, it proved to be possible to sublet the second floor and what had been a large drawing room on the first floor. The house had passed through many changes since it had been built in 1856 for the homestead of one of Chicago's pioneer citizens, Mr. Charles J. Hall, and although battered by its vicissitudes, was essentially sound. Before it had been occupied by the factory, it had sheltered a second-hand furniture store, and at one time the Little Sisters of the Poor had used it for a home for the aged. It had a half-spectacle reputation for a haunted attic, so far respected by the tenants living on the second floor that they always kept a large pitcher full of water on the attic stairs. Their explanation of this custom was so incoherent that I was sure it was a survival of the belief that a ghost could not cross running water, but perhaps that interpretation was only my eagerness to finding folklore. The fine old house responded kindly to repairs, its wide hall and open fireplace always ensuring it a gracious aspect. Its generous owner, Miss Helen Culver, in the following spring gave us a free leasehold of the entire house. Her kindness has continued through the years until the group of 13 buildings, which at present comprises our equipment, is built largely upon land which Miss Culver has put at the service of the settlement, which bears Mrs. Hall's name. In those days, the house stood between an undertaking establishment and a saloon, Night, Death, and the Devil. The three were called by a Chicago wit, and yet any mock heroics which might be implied by comparing the settlement to a night quickly dropped away under the genuine kindness and hearty welcome extended to us by the families living up and down the street. We furnished the house as we would have furnished it were it in another part of the city, with the photographs and other impedimenta we had collected in Europe, and which is few bits of family mahogany. While all the new furniture which was bought was enduring in quality, we were careful to keep it in character with the fine old residence. Probably no young matron ever placed her own things in her own house with more pleasure than that with which we first furnished Hull House. We believe that the settlement may logically bring to its aid all those adjuncts which the cultivated man regards as good and suggestive of the best of the life of the past. On the 18th of September, 1889, Miss Starr and I moved into it, with Miss Mary Kaiser, who began performing the housework, but who quickly developed into a very important factor in the life of the vicinity as well as that of the household, and whose death 5 years later was most sincerely mourned by hundreds of our neighbors. In our enthusiasm over settling the first night, we forgot not only to lock, but to close a side door opening on Polk Street, and we were much pleased in the morning to find that we possessed a fine illustration of the honesty and kindliness of our new neighbors. Our first guest was an interesting young woman who lived in a neighboring tenement, whose widowed mother aided her in the support of the family by scrubbing a downtown theater every night. The mother, of English birth, was well-bred and carefully educated, but was in the midst of that bitter struggle which awaits so many strangers in American cities who find that their social position tends to be measured solely by the standards of living they are able to maintain. Our guest has long since married the struggling young lawyer to whom she was then engaged, and he is now leading his profession in an eastern city. She recalls that She recalls that month experiment always with a sense of amusement over the fact that the succession of visitors who came to see the new settlement invariably questioned her most minutely concerning these people without once suspecting that they were talking to one who had been identified with the neighborhood from childhood. I, at least, was able to draw a lesson from the incident, and I never addressed a Chicago audience on the subject of the settlement and its vicinity without inviting a neighbor to go with me, that I might curb any hasty generalization by the consciousness that I had an auditor who knew the conditions more intimately than I could hope to do. Halsted Street has grown so familiar during 20 years of residence that it is difficult to recall its gradual changes, the withdrawal of the more prosperous Irish and Germans, and the slow substitution of Russian Jews, Italians, and Greeks. A description of the street, such as I gave in those early addresses, still stands in my mind as sympathetic and correct. Halsted Street is 32 miles long and one of the great thoroughfares of Chicago. Polk Street crosses it midway between the stockyards to the south and the shipbuilding yards on the north branch of the Chicago River. For the 6 miles between these two industries, the street is lined with shops of butchers and grocers, with dingy and gorgeous saloons, and pretentious establishments for the sale of ready-made clothing. Polk Street, running west from Halsted Street, grows rapidly more prosperous, running a mile east to State Street. It grows steadily worse and crosses a network of Ys on the corners of Clark Street and Fifth Avenue. Hull House once stood in the suburbs, but the city has steadily grown up around it, and its site now has corners on 3 or 4 foreign colonies. Between Halsted Street and the river live around about 10,000 Italians, Neapolitans, Sicilians, and Calabrians, with an occasional Lombard or Venetian. To the south of 12th Street are many Germans. Any side streets are given over almost entirely to Polish and Russian Jews. Still farther south, these Jewish colonies merge into a huge Bohemian colony, so vast that Chicago ranks as the 3rd Bohemian city in the world. To the northwest are many Canadian French, clannish in spite of their long distance in America. And to the north are Irish and first-generation Americans. On the streets directly west and farther north are well-to-do English-speaking families, many of whom own their own houses and have lived in the neighborhood for years. One man is still living in his old farmhouse. The policy of the public authorities of never taking an initiative and always waiting to be urged to do their duty is obviously fatal in a neighborhood where there is little initiative among the citizens. The idea underlying our self-government breaks down in such a ward. The streets are inexpressibly dirty, the number of schools inadequate, sanitary legislation unenforced, the street lighting bad, the paving miserable, and altogether lacking in the alleys and smaller streets, and the stables foul beyond description. Hundreds of houses are unconnected with the street sewer. The older and richer inhabitants seem anxious to move away as rapidly as they can afford it. They make room for newly arrived immigrants who are densely ignorant of civic duties. This substitution of the older inhabitants is accomplished industrially also in the south and east quarters of the ward. The Jews and Italians do the finishing for the great clothing manufacturers, formerly done by Americans, Irish, and Germans, who refuse to submit to the extremely low prices to which the sweating system has reduced their successors. As the design of the sweating system is the elimination of rent from the manufacture of clothing, the outside work is begun after the clothing leaves the cutter. An unscrupulous contractor regards no basement as too dark, no stable loft too foul, no rear shanty too provisional, no tenement room too small for his workroom, as these conditions imply low rental. Hence, these shops abroad in the worst of the foreign districts where the sweater easily finds his cheap basement and his home finishers. The houses of the ward, for the most part wooden, were originally built for one family and are now occupied by several. They are after the type of the inconvenient frame cottages found in the poorer suburbs 20 years ago. Many of them were built where they now stand. Others were bought thither on rollers because their previous sites had been taken by factories. The fewer brick tenements buildings, which are 3 or 4 stories high, are comparatively new, and there are few large tenements. The little wooden houses have a temporary aspect, and for this reason, perhaps, the tenement house legislation in Chicago is totally inadequate. Rear tenements flourish. Many houses have no water supply, save the faucet in the backyard. There are no fire escapes. The garbage and ashes are placed in wooden boxes, which are fastened to the street pavements. One of the most discouraging features about the present system of tenement houses is that many are owned by sordid and ignorant immigrants. The theory that wealth brings responsibility, that possession entails at length education and refinement, in these cases fails utterly. The children of an Italian immigrant owner may shine shoes in the street, and his wife may pick rags from the street gutter, laboriously sorting them in a dingy court. Wealth may do something for herself. Complacency and feeling of consequence. It certainly does nothing for her comfort or her children's improvement, nor for the cleanliness of anyone concerned. Another thing that prevents better houses in Chicago is the tentative attitude of the real estate man. Many unsavory conditions are allowed to continue, which would be regarded with horror if they were considered permanent. Meanwhile, the wretched conditions persist until at least 2 generations of children have been born and reared in them. In every neighborhood where poorer people live, because rents are supposed to be cheaper, there's an element which, although uncertain in the individual, in the aggregate can be counted upon. It is composed of people of former education and opportunity who have cherished ambitions and prospects, but who are characters of what they meant to be, hollow ghosts which blame the living man. There are times in many lives where there is a cessation of energy and loss of power. Man and woman of education and refinement come to live in a cheaper neighborhood because they lack the ability to make money. Because of ill health, because of an unfortunate marriage, or for other reasons which do not imply criminality or stupidity. Among them are those who, in spite of untoward circumstances, keep up some sort of an intellectual life, those who are great for books, as their neighbors say. To such the settlement may be a genuine refuge. In the very first weeks of our residence, Miss Starr started a reading party in George Eliot's Romola, which was attended by a group of young women who followed the wonderful tale with unflagging interest. The weekly reading was held in our little upstairs dining room, and 2 members of the club came to dinner each week. Not only that they might be received as guests, but that they might help us wash the dishes afterwards, and so make the table ready for the stacks of Florentine photographs. Our first residence, as the gaily designated herself, was a charming old lady who gave 5 consecutive readings from Hawthorne to a most appreciative audience, interspersing the magic tales most delightfully with recollections of the elusive and fascinating author. Years before she had lived at Brook Farm as a pupil of the Riplies, and she came to us for 10 days before she wished to live once more in an atmosphere where idealism ran high. We thus early found the type of class which through all the years has remained most popular, a combination of a social atmosphere with serious study. Volunteers to a new undertaking came quickly. A charming young girl conducted a kindergarten in the drawing room, coming regularly every morning from her home in a distant part of the north side of the city. Although a tablet to her memory has stood upon a mantel-shelf in Hull House for 5 years, we still associate her most vividly with the play of little children, first in her kindergarten and then in her own nursery, which furnished a veritable illustration of Victor Hugo's definition of heaven, a place where parents are always young and children always little. Her daily presence for the first 2 years made it quite impossible for us to become too solemn and self-conscious in our strenuous routine. For her mirth and buoyancy, her irresistible and her eager desire to share the life of the neighborhood never failed, although it was often put to a severe test. One day at luncheon, she gaily recited her futile attempt to impress temperance principles upon the mind of an Italian mother, to whom she had returned a small daughter of 5 sent to the kindergarten in quite a horrid state of intoxication from the wine-soaked bread upon which she had breakfast. The mother, with the gentle courtesy of a South Italian, listened politely to her graphic portrayal of the untimely end awaiting so immature a wine-bibber. But long before the lecture was finished, quite unconscious of the incongruity, she hospitably set forth her best wines, and when her baffled guests refused one after the other, she disappeared, only to quickly return with a small dark glass of whiskey, saying reassuringly, "See, I have bought you the true American drink." The recital ended in serio-comic despair, with the rueful statement that the impression I probably made on her darkened mind was that it was the American custom to breakfast children on bread soaked in whiskey instead of light Italian wine. That first kindergarten was a constant source of education to us. We were much surprised to find social distinctions even among its lambs, although greatly amused with the need formulation made by the superior little Italian boy who refused to sit beside uncouth little Angelina because we ate her macaroni this way, imitating the movement of a fork from a plate to his mouth. And she eats her macaroni this way, holding his hand high in the air and throwing back his head that his wide open mouth might receive an imaginary cascade. Angelina gravely nodded her little head in approval of this distinction between gentry and peasant. But isn't it astonishing that merely table manners are made such a test all the way along, was the comment of the democratic teacher. Another memory which refuses to be associated with death, which came to her all too soon, is that the young girl who organized our first really successful club of boys, holding their fascinated interest by the old chivalric tale set forth so dramatically and vividly, that checkers and jackstraws were abandoned by all the other clubs on Boys' Day, that their members might form a listening fringe to the young heroes. I met a member of the latter club one day as he flung himself out of the house in the rage by which an emotional boy hopes to keep from shedding tears. "There is no use coming here any more. Prince Roland is dead," he gruffly explained as we passed. We encouraged the young boys in tournaments and dramatics of all sorts, and we somehow fatuously believed that boys who were early interested in adventures or explorers might later want to know the lives of living statesmen and inventors. It is needless to add that the boys quickly responded to such a program, and that the only difficulty lay in finding leaders who were able to carry it out. The difficulty has been with us through all the years and growth and development in the Boys' Club until now, with its 5-story building, its splendid equipment of shops, and recreation and study rooms. That group alone is successful which commands the services of a resourceful and devoted leader. The dozens of younger children who from the first came to Hull House were organized into groups which were not quite classes and not quite clubs. The value of these groups consisted almost entirely in arousing a higher imagination and in giving the children the opportunity which they could not have in the crowded schools, for initiative and for independent social relationships. The public schools then contained little handwork of any sort, so that naturally any instruction which we provided for the children took the direction of this supplementary work. But it required a constant effort that the pressure of poverty itself should not defeat the educational aim. The Italian girls in the sewing classes would count the day lost when they couldn't carry home a garment, and the insistence that it should be neatly made seemed a super refinement to those in dire need of clothing. As these clubs have continued during the 20 years, they have developed classes in many forms of handicraft, which the newer education is so rapidly adapting for the delight of children, but they still keep their essentially social character and still minister to that large number of children who leave school the very week they are 14 years old, only too eager to close the schoolroom door forever on a tiresome task that it is at last well over. It seems so important It seems to us important that these children shall find themselves permanently attached to a house that offers them evening clubs and classes with their old companions, that merges as easily as possible the school life into the working life, and does what it can to find places for the bewildered young things looking for work. A large proportion of the delinquent boys brought into the juvenile court in Chicago are the oldest sons in large families whose wages are needed at home. The grades from which many of them leave school, as the record shows, are piteously far from the seventh and eighth, where the very first introduction in manual training is given, nor have they been caught by any other abiding interest. So I'm gonna stop here. I hope it was interesting for you to get an insight of the development and, as she also talked about in the beginning, the struggles they faced before creating and founding the Hull House, as there were many people who like didn't believe in themselves, in the creation of the Hull House and in Adams and her colleague, and thought it was unnecessary. But as we all know, in the end, like, all the efforts were worth it for sure, and it's good that they didn't give up, although they got criticized a lot, because we know that, as she also mentioned now, like, the Hull House itself became a second home to like many people, and the workshops and clubs they offered, it was like an escape from reality to many of the kids. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it interesting, and yes, bye.